Dr. Nicholas Kardaras is a psychotherapist who specializes in screen addiction. After 10 years as a clinical professor at Stony Brook Medicine, he became CEO of 2 addiction and mental health treatment programs.
Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Kardaras, and it's my pleasure to be here at the EMF conference. I'm really thrilled to have been invited to speak here, and I want to thank the organizers and Elizabeth for having invited me to speak. So I'd like to talk, my presentation today, I'm going to try to get some really what I think are impactful bits of information in the landscape of what's happening with the digital age and intersection with our mental health. And if I can back up a little bit, what we're seeing now is things beyond tech addiction. There's been a lot of things in the news about habituation to our devices, and we love our smartphones, and kids getting addicted to things like video games and social media. And while all that may be true, and when I first came to this subject several years ago as a psychologist who was working with young people and who began to see the clinical signs of addiction with our amazing marvels of modern digital age, that's all true. We started seeing that kids became and were showing all the signs and symptoms of what we might consider a full-blown addictive disorder. But now what we're seeing, and what I'd really like to highlight, is how does that impact what we're seeing as a global psychiatric crisis right now? Right now, we have the worst epidemic of mental health than we've ever had. And this is pre-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, we had the worst depression rates, suicide rates, ADHD rates, anxiety rates. By every metric of mental health, we were on fire psychiatrically and disproportionately impacting young people. People 35 and under were disproportionately suffering from things like I just mentioned. And what my colleagues and I and people that have been studying this, we think that the tipping point for our mental health, what's pushed us over the edge, is this new way of being, the digital age. The digital age is antithetical to the way we were meant to live. And so the reason why we may be more depressed, more self-medicating, more prone to hurt ourselves, to not want to live anymore, as I'll explain in this presentation, might be directly related to this perfect storm that's happened, this intersection of digital and our society. The essential narrative is that human beings weren't genetically designed to be screen-staring, atomized, not connected. We weren't meant to be in front of a screen for 11 hours a day. That's just not the way that human beings were designed. Let's understand why we've become so seduced by technology. What is it specifically about the digital that has been so seismically impactful of our species, and why it's so alluring to our species? So there's 3 basic drives that the digital really tickles in our way of being as humans. The first one is our need for social connection. We are hardwired for social connection. The tribe survives has been a phrase that's been used. And if you look at the slide here, you'll see that the first social network is the bottom left. The tribe that stayed together had a better chance of survival. And so we became psychologically and genetically hardwired to be social. And, that's not a newsflash to a lot of people. And a lot of research has showed what happens to human beings when we're in isolation. Dr. Hebb presented research back in the 1950s of humans in isolation. And it was everything from psychosis to physiological disorders. We're just not meant to not be a social species. And part of our need to have a social network is the fact that, again, going back to a survival standpoint, we're not the strongest species. We're potentially the smartest in self-destructive ways, but we weren't the fastest nor the strongest. And so there were strength in numbers. And that was a survival adaptation. The second piece is a thing called neophilia. We are a profoundly exploratory, inquisitive species. And neophilia is our need to explore and discover new things. Literally, it's a love of the new. And so we were always interested in what lay over the horizon, but our species needed to explore, invent. It gave us the ability to invent tools. It gave us the ability to harness our environment, to discover new ways to grow crops. And so we're exploratory, we're inquisitive, and that became hardwired into our psychological DNA. And that's also tapped by the digital. The digital picks our interest in a very dopamine activating way, and I'll get to the dopamine piece a little bit further along here. So we're hardwired social, we're hardwired inquisitive, and the other piece that the digital taps into that doesn't often get spoken enough about is our need for archetypal experiences. Cross-culturally, we've known throughout history, and everybody from Carl Jung to Joseph Campbell has spoken about our need for archetypal experiences. And the classic one is the hero's journey. But myth and meaning making is also part of our psychological DNA. And our sense of finding purpose is really embedded into who we are as humans. And a lot of that, quite frankly, had been vacuumed out of the 20th century social structure. Things like religion and community organizations had been eliminated effectively. And yet we have that profound thirst. And so it's no coincidence that things like video games are essentially the hero's journey writ small in the digital platform. And those tap into the need for a lot of young people to feel that sense of purpose and adventure, which is readily available in a gaming platform. So those are the three drives that drive the digital. So how did we get here? And we saw 25, 30 years ago, and here's a cover of Newsweek back in 1996, we had sort of a wide-eyed optimism about what technology can do for us. And as you see, there's a Norman Rockwell-ish like cover of a young girl, a young student in her laptop, and can PCs make your kid a better student? So there was this idea that technology can help us, can bring us to the next level. And yet a few years later, 16 years later, Newsweek had a very different cover story when we really had a bigger bite of technology, and our children were more immersed in technology at that point. And that Newsweek cover story, crazy, panic, depression, psychosis. We began to see some of the psychological impacts of technology. Now, what was happening? Why should that be? Why is technology impacting people? And one of the things that I think it's important to understand is people of a certain generation, and I put myself in that group, I'm 56, people over 35, we were underaware of the different type of psychological impact that modern technology was having as opposed to television. I think many of us conflated modern tech with television, and many of us who grew up on television felt, well, what's the harm? These are essentially smaller, more portable TV sets. And most of us grew up fine. What can be the problem? And what we're seeing is that the main increased psychological impact of screens are that they're immersive and interactive in a way that television never was. So television was a passive viewing experience. When I watched Starsky and Hutch as a kid in the early 70s, or whatever show you might have watched as a child, you were a passive viewer of the TV experience. Now you're immersed and you're an interactive participant in that experience, which makes the psychological impact much more impactful. And also the fact that they're portable makes the experience much more ubiquitous. You couldn't carry around your old television set, but you can certainly carry around your smartphone wherever you go. So that makes it much more available in a problematic way. So portability, and here we see what this has led to. Here we see the new species of our times, the head down, text neck youth of society. I don't think this is a news flash for anybody who's alive on the planet and has eyes. We've seen children and young people and adults entirely transformed by their fixation on our new technology. When I do these conferences in person, I usually ask by a show of hands, how many of us, the adults in the room, feel that we may have a problematic love affair with our technology? And most of the hands go up. And so the question that begs asking is, if we as the adults have a problem regulating our tech experiences or our screen time, what chance does a 6-year-old or a 16-year-old or a 21-year-old have with this very powerful habituating type of screen immersion? And I'll talk about why it's addicting shortly. But back to the mental health impacts, we know now that, as I mentioned earlier, we're having an explosion of psychiatric outcomes. And the one that I really want to focus on, and so we know that suicide rates have doubled in adolescents over the last 10 years. And those of us that are frontline clinicians are seeing this type of behavior. Why are young people much more suicidal now than they've ever been? In fact, now we have a category, pediatric suicide, that used to be non-existent over 10 years ago. Now it's a national statistic. Pediatric suicide, children 7 and 8 years old are committing suicide when this was unimaginable a generation ago. So, but I want to focus on the last cube here, where it says teens who use electronic devices for at least, and I have to move my, teens' use of electronic devices for at least 5 hours daily more than doubled. And this is from 2009 to 2015. Now here's the key nugget of information. These teens were 70% more likely to have suicidal thoughts or actions than those who reported 1 hour of daily use. Now that's not an insignificant number. That's not 7%, that's 70% more likely to be suicidal, have suicidal ideations or actions. So if I'm on the screen for an hour versus 5 hours, I'm 70% more likely to want to hurt myself. So again, we have to ask ourselves, what about this experience is making a young person suicidal? It is affecting our psychiatric profile in such a way that we become, what we call self-injurious. So what we're seeing is an entire generation that's crying out for help. We're in crisis, and we need to do something to address this. And I'm afraid that the mental health profession has been entirely underaware of what the intersection of technology and mental health has created. And what we've seen is that there's several categories of clinical impacts. Yes, there's tech addiction, and we've seen an epidemic of ADHD disorders, and the research fairly clearly suggests, which I'll show, the impact of ADHD and screen time. We've seen increased aggression. We've seen an epidemic of anxiety and depression. And we've seen even psychotic disorders where people lose themselves in the hyper reality of a screen experience. And in fact, that was how I came to this field. About 12 years ago, I had a young man that was referred to my office who was 16 years old, who had been playing World of Warcraft for 12 hours a day, who was fully in the matrix. He had what we call derealization. He didn't know what was real and what wasn't. And he was having what another way of calling derealization would be video game psychosis. This was a young man without any prior psychiatric history. His psychotic episode was purely a byproduct of being immersed in the reality blurring gaming platform that he had been playing hour after hour. Add gaming immersion and sleep deprivation, and those two things together have led to several different types of psychotic episodes. And these have been chronicled over the last 10 years now. So when we start looking at clinical impacts, we begin to understand that screen time does affect the brain essentially like a drug. And so we begin to use the language digital drugs. And I wrote a op-ed for the New York Post 4 years ago called Digital Heroin, 5 years ago, which was the most widely read article in the New York Post that year, 7 million views and shares, because it hit a nerve. When I wrote Digital Heroin, I was one of the first people that began to speak of technology as the new drug, as the new habit-forming, habituating experience. But I wasn't the first. Dr. Peter Wybrow at UCLA called it electronic cocaine years ago. Andrew Doan at the US Pentagon, who studies addictive disorders, has called it digital pharmakia. And Chinese researchers have been calling it electronic heroin for over a decade. So let's understand how technology hooks us in. Let's understand how it tickles what's called the dopamine reward loop, because that's essentially what happens. Now, dopamine, going back to evolution again, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's been embedded into our genetics as incentivizing two life-sustaining activities. Essentially, dopamine gets tickled or lit up when we eat and when we procreate. And so a dopamine spike when someone eats or when somebody has sex is meant to incentivize it. Those are life-sustaining aspects of dopamine. They incentivize those two behaviors. But things like substance abuse and digital experiences hijack the dopamine response in a way that has no life-sustaining or benefit. When you're gaming hour after hour and you're spiking your dopamine, there's no benefit to that. There's no benefit to you individually or to the species. And so what we've seen is that, and this is an older study, a 1998 study by Dr. Cope, looked at what we call the dopaminergic response. And he looked at how different, and this was in Nature magazine, it was peer reviewed, and it looked at how different activities and different experiences raised our dopamine levels, or different substances. And what he found, and this was a 1998 study, that video games back in 1998 raised our dopamine to the same level that sex did. They were both 100% dopaminergic, while something like food was 50% dopamine activating. Now that's a problem, because we know that the more that something can raise your dopamine, the more potential for addiction that substance or experience has. And essentially my narrative is that we're giving children something that's effectively the same as an electronic brain orgasm, and then we expect them to moderate that behavior when they effectively don't have the impulse control yet. Children don't have the neurological apparatus of a fully developed prefrontal cortex to be able to moderate such hyper-arousing and stimulating experiences. They just don't have that. And the other problem is that if a young person is doing something like gaming, that dopamine activation goes on for hour after hour, day after day, week after week. Not to be crude, but a sexual experience tends to be short-lived, where a digital experience could go